time since we did a history video, and I figured for this one we would cover not just one but multiple different events. Now, additionally, I have this list of 20 wars that influenced and affected the modern world that we live in today. By no means, I'm sure, an extensive list, but it's what this pretty well-researched page has listed. But essentially, we're going to be covering 10 in today's video, and then if this video hits, let's say 300 likes, I'll go ahead and record and upload the second part, which I imagine will have the two world wars in, because it's history. These videos are going to be in chronological order. So yeah, be sure to like the video. I'm sure this video will involve a lot of images which take a long time to source, so a like is greatly appreciated, and I will be sure to make a part 2 if you desire it. Also, in both these videos, evidently it's going to be a pretty brief overview of each of the wars, but be sure to let me know in the comments which of the wars you'd like a dedicated video on, because there are plenty on this list that we are yet to do a dedicated video for. So leave a like and leave a comment what war you would like to see a dedicated video for. But enough rambling, let's get into the history. So we begin with the Crusades. The Crusades were launched in 1095 at the Council of Clermont, when Pope Urban II called for military support of Byzantine Emperor Alexios I in his campaign to push the Seljuk Turk population out of Greece. This was a call to arms by the Latin Catholic Church to the kingdoms of Europe to proliferate the Christian faith by force, beginning with a march to the Holy Land and its reclamation from Muslim rule. This initiated a centuries-long period in which people of every station, kings, armies, clergy, feudal lords and peasants, found purpose in rooting out heretics and non-Christians from the far reaches of Europe into Eurasia and the Mediterranean. This set off an unending series of battles and wars between Christian crusaders and Muslim armies in Jerusalem, the broad and Near East, and the Iberian Peninsula during the 12th century. The Muslim armies were famously led by the Egyptian Sultan Saladin, who in his own right expanded the Ayyubid dynasty across the land of Egypt, Syria, Yemen, Iraq and more. This expansion brought two diverging religious practices into constant conflict with one another. The Crusades also included clashes within and massacres of Jewish settlements, campaigns against pagan Slavic tribes in northern Europe, and by the 13th century against Christian heretics such as the Cathars of Languedoc. So, what were the lasting impacts of the Crusades? Well, when historians refer to the Crusades, this most often refers to the first, whose primary impetus was to capture the Holy Land. This crusade, initiated with Pope Urban's 1095 proclamation, climaxed with the 200-year Christian occupation of Jerusalem in 1099, and ended when the Crusaders were besieged and chased from all Crusader states, the last of these being Tripoli in 1289 and Accra in 1291. However, as noted above, the First Crusade would inspire centuries of confrontation across countless lines of both papal and royal succession. Subsequent crusades saw campaigns against the proto-Protestant ascetics called the Waldensians in Savoy, and the Hussite Christians in Bohemia during the 15th century, and against the Protestants throughout Europe during the 16th century. The 14th century also initiated a period of confrontation with the rising Moorish Ottoman Empire that would persist for the next 400 years. The number of wars, kings and theatres implicated by the Crusades is lengthy, and the ebb and flow of power in key locations like Jerusalem, Antioch, Edessa, Constantinople and Tripoli is complex. It's not an exaggeration to argue that the Crusades were a prime driver of both territorial power and religious rule for at least the first 5 centuries of the previous millennium. Moreover, it is inestimable just how many individuals, communities and states were converted to Christianity, routed of non-Christians during this period. The Crusades were a major force in linking the Christian faith with various seats of power throughout the known world. We now have the Mongol Conquests. During the 13th and 14th centuries, the Mongol Empire expanded rapidly and aggressively, employing its powerful land forces to sweep across much of Eurasia. Through an ongoing series of invasions and conquests, the Mongols accumulated grazing lands for their singular wealth of cattle and cavalry. Beginning with a series of victories across Asia in the early 1200s, the Mongols had penetrated Eastern Europe by the 1240s. The Mongol hordes that swept across the continent invoked terror for their singular brutality. They toppled cities, destroyed villages and killed millions in their wake. Some estimates hold that anywhere between 37 and 60 million people were killed by invading Mongolians, with the largest concentration of carnage occurring in Central Asia and Eastern Europe. In addition to their violent and destructive tactics, the Mongols carried bubonic plague with them to many targeted settlements, only further magnifying the impact of their presence. Some estimates regard the Mongolian conquest as the deadliest conflict in human history. This assessment holds up to scrutiny when one considers the Mongolian Empire was, at its peak in the mid-13th century, the largest contiguous empire in history. This peak can be pinned to the year 1271, when Kublai Khan conquered China and established the Yuan Dynasty, which would rule the expansive Chinese state for a century. Even as the empire began to splinter through ongoing conflict with various Eastern European powers, the Mongols ruled China for much of the 14th century, held sway over Persia through the 15th century, and served as a direct bloodline to the Mughal conqueror Babur, who spent the 16th century expanding his empire through India, Kashmir and Afghanistan. The influence of this latter Mughal empire persisted in India well into the 19th century. The decline of the peak Mongolian Empire began with the death of Kublai Khan in 1294. His departure coincided with a series of internal wars that saw the singular Khanate splintering into at least 4 major powers: the Yuan dynasty, the Golden Horde, the Chagatai Khanate, and the Ilkhanate. This touched off a century of independent development for each of the Khanates. By the 14th century, constant violent internal wrangling fractured the Khanate structure, ultimately leading to a dismantling of the unified Mongolian horde, and prompted the gradual contraction in its occupied territories. Third on this list, we have the Spanish conquest of the Aztecs. So, they also achieved considerable military might, which they used to expand size in 1519, the Aztec Empire would, in this very same year, come face to face with its own destruction. Having already established a presence in the Caribbean, the Spanish set forth on the path of expansion into the Americas. Thus, conquistador Hernán Cortés would lead an expedition to confront the Aztec Empire, which was seated in present-day Mexico. While we think of the conquering of the Aztecs as European aggression against indigenous peoples, Cortés actually formed an alliance with the bevy of civilizations who opposed the expansion of Mexico. City-states that joined Cortés in felling the Aztecs included Tlaxcalteca and Texcoco. Over a period of 2 years, the Spanish and the Aztecs claimed significant casualties against one another, and in some respects, the two sides were technologically matched in their war-making capabilities. But the Europeans inadvertently carried infectious diseases into battle with them, proliferating smallpox and prompting famine. These factors substantially weakened the local populations and made the indigenous rulers especially vulnerable to the bold Spanish attack on the Aztec Empire's superstructure. Because the Aztecs developed a relatively advanced system of city-states, Spanish conquest largely revolved on the occupation of these city-states and their conversion into feudal territories with allegiance to the Spanish crown. So when Tenochtitlan fell to Cortés and his allies, it offered a ready-made capital, the future Mexico City. Moreover, the configuration of city-states facilitated ready-made Spanish rule and propped up a system of local noblemen who helped to collect taxes, enforce the rule of the crown, and spread Christianity among formerly indigenous religious traditions. So, looking at the lasting impact of the Spanish conquest of the Aztecs, in just 2 years of conflict, the mighty indigenous empire of the Aztecs had fallen. This signalled the beginning of the Spanish Empire in the Americas, as well as the founding of Mexico and the establishment of Mexico City as the new capital. The collapse of the Aztec Empire opened Central and South America to total Spanish rule. It was also a relative first for the Spanish crown. The military tactics that led to Spanish victory in Mexico would soon serve as the template for conquest throughout South and Central America. As a consequence, Spanish culture, language and forms of worship spread throughout the New World in a way which remains readily apparent today, on a continent where Spanish is a dominant language. Moreover, the Spanish conquests and centuries of occupation and genetic intermingling have eradicated numerous indigenous cultures, with the practices of peoples such as the Aztecs, Incas and Mayans fading into historical obscurity. Thus, a clear and lasting impact of this war would be the wholesale replacement of numerous native cultures with a more monolithic Spanish-European culture. Next up, we have the 30 Years' War. Now, the key participants in this war were Bohemia, the German region, the Palatinate, however you say it, the German region again, and then the Dutch Republic, Spanish/Austrian Habsburg Empire, the French House of Bourbon, Denmark and Sweden. region's proximity to the major trade and military route known as the Spanish Road made it particularly consequential to the seats of power throughout Europe. Civil war in Bohemia and Palatinate broke out even as the 80 Years' War persisted. In this longer conflict, the Spanish crown fought against the Dutch Republic to suppress revolt across the so-called 17 provinces that make up parts of present-day Netherlands and Luxembourg. The internal splintering in Germany attracted the involvement of both the Dutch Republic and the Spanish crown, who expanded the focus of their ongoing conflict into the now contested Palatinate region. Kings with their own designs on expansion invested in the war, including Christian IV of Denmark. Oh no, that's not. Is that the fourth? Oh gosh, I'm so bad with my numerals. And Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden. As a consequence, the war for control expanded widely throughout Europe, bringing a terrible toll to bear for the entirety of the Holy Roman Empire. The war is typically divided into two periods. The first period is largely thought of as a civil war between competing imperial states, lasting until 1635. This portion of the conflict was somewhat more geographically contained in the disputed regions of Germany. By 1635, the conflict had widened dramatically, pitting France with support from Sweden against the Spanish crown and Emperor Ferdinand III. The war was finally drawn to a conclusion with the 1648 agreement, known as the Peace of Westphalia, but not before it claimed anywhere between 4.5 and 8 million lives. Some estimates hold that as many as 60% of all Germans may have been killed in this conflict. So in terms of impact, the Peace of Westphalia permanently altered European power dynamics, with the treaty's provisions granting greater autonomy for individual states within the Holy Roman Empire, including Bavaria, Saxony, and a newly independent Dutch Republic. This growing independence would signal a contraction of the ruling Habsburg family's control over Europe. In doing so, these events tilted the balance of power in favour of the French, ultimately laying the groundwork for the French military, political and cultural dominance of Europe in the next era. The half-century that followed would see the initiation of the Wars of Louis the... oh gosh, is that 10th? Lord knows what number that is. The Franco-Dutch War, the 9 Years' War, and the War of the Spanish Succession. Next we have the Qing versus Ming Dynasty. This started in 1618 and ended in 1683. So, the Mongol-led Yuan dynasty ruled China for just under 100 years. The collapse of the Mongolian Empire brought about the rule of the Ming dynasty of Han Chinese lineage. For nearly 300 years, the Ming dynasty ruled China with an emphasis on an enormous and powerful standing army and a highly agrarian society driven by land ownership. This was a historical divergence from China's Confucian meritocratic bureaucracies. So, under this new model, the Ming dynasty navigated China through various periods of both economic struggle and prosperity. The Ming dynasty left behind a number of lasting achievements in China's cultural history, including the establishment of the capital city of Beijing, the construction of the Forbidden City, and, several decades hence, completion of the Great Wall of China. Also of great consequence, the Ming dynasty saw the Chinese Empire through the age of exploration, when European traders with their tremendous interest in Chinese goods brought an influx of riches to China. However, a series of unfortunate events would render this a short-lived time of prosperity. A combination of sustained cold weather conditions, crop failures, flooding, changes in Japanese and Spanish trade policies, and the permeating impact of the Great Plague all served to weaken the Ming dynasty's hold over China. Thus, China was ripe for the taking. In the midst of this struggle and discontent, revolts to the empire sprang up like leaks all over China. Prominent among them was one by rebel leader Li Zicheng, who founded and subsequently declared himself emperor of the Shun dynasty before beginning the march toward Beijing. Even as this rebel force advanced, a much broader coalition of resistance formed at the initiation of Manchu Chinese groups. They led the armies known as the Eight Banners, a force which increasingly came to include those absorbed through conquest such as defeated Mongols and Han Chinese. In fact, many Han Chinese from the Ming dynasty's military class were wooed away to the Eight Banners army as a reprieve from the discrimination they generally experienced in the now collapsed dynasty. Because the Manchu welcomed Han defectors, and even allowed defecting officers to hold their existing titles and command their own Han units, the Han Chinese were soon the dominant portion of the competing army. By 1631, Han Chinese defectors were at the helm of the military strategy for the emergent Qing dynasty. Still, even as the Ming dynasty attempted to ward off the Qing armies, the emperor was more concerned with the array of rebel groups raising resistance across China. The Ming Zhongzhen emperor was right to be concerned. In 1964, rebel leader Li Zicheng entered Beijing and seized power. The emperor called to his armies for help, leaving his position in the stronghold of Ningguan outside the Great Wall of China unprotected. As the Ming armies departed to save the capital, the king seized an enormous expanse of territory. Back in Beijing, it was Li Zicheng's intent to declare himself emperor and share rule with the deposed emperor. But that opportunity never came to pass, for as the rebel army enveloped the capital, the emperor retreated behind the walls of the Forbidden City and hanged himself. He would be the last Ming emperor in China's history. The king saw their opportunity to avenge the death of the emperor and declare the mandate of heaven to rule China on behalf of the Manchu prince. Beijing was sacked by a multi-ethnic army of Manchu, Mongols and Huns, a fact which distinguished this not as an ethnic conflict but a class war. Still, the king faced a sprawling territory marked by both rebel resistance and lingering Ming authority in nearly every region. The next 4 decades would be marked by conflict throughout the Chinese Empire, as the Qing Empire established its authority. Where the Qing were met with capitulation, they spared the surrendering cities. Where they were met with resistance, they massacred populations mercilessly. It is said that the Wars of Succession claimed the lives of as many as 25 million people. So when at last the king achieved a unified rule in the 1680s, they established the Chinese state, which was held to include the present-day regions of Manchuria, Mongolia, Tibet, Xinjiang, and more. The Qing dynasty was the first to recognize China as an inherently multi-ethnic state, reflecting the nature of the Eight Banners that brought about the end of the Ming Empire. It would be a century before China would recover from the economic devastation of this bloody conflict. and the 7 Years' War were both fought in the colonies. The wars had a permeating impact on resources for the Brits and the colonists alike. The former had been plunged into deep debt by their participation in these long, sustained conflicts, and the colonies had also supplied the British at their own expense with encampment, equipment and resources at a cost of millions. The result was economic tension on both sides of the Atlantic. The British magnified this tension by imposing a series of expenses on the colonies, most notably through the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts. I'm actually not sure. I did this topic at uni and I don't know. These acts granted the British Crown the power to impose taxes upon the colonies at will. The early 1770s saw tension escalating into outright violence, most notably at the Boston Massacre in 1770, where an outnumbered contingent of British soldiers opened fire on an unruly mob of colonists, killing 5. The event sparked a growing movement of resistance among colonists, which was further catalysed in the writing of prominent New Englanders and future revolutionary heroes like Samuel Adams and Paul Revere. 1773 saw the famous Boston Tea Party demonstration in which a mercantile group called the Sons of Liberty protested British taxation in the colonies by dumping an entire shipment of British East India Company tea into the Boston harbour. This proved a breaking point in the tensions and signalled an inevitable escalation in the battle for control over the colonies. The British Parliament responded with a set of laws called the Intolerable Acts, which, among other things, stripped Massachusetts of its right to self-governance and deprived Boston of its right to control its own commerce. These impositions only instigated further protest among the colonies, who responded by convening the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia and subsequently petitioning Britain's King George III to immediately repeal the oppressive new laws. Instead, the British only clamped down harder on the colonists, violently repressing displays of rebellion. Then in April of 1775, British forces destroyed the colonial assemblies at Powder Store. This act was met with confrontation by the Massachusetts militia in Lexington and Concord. By June, the Second Continental Congress convened to appoint George Washington as general of a newly established Continental Army. 1 month later, the colonists sent a petition to the King and British Parliament seeking peace negotiations. When this was rejected, the colonists issued the Declaration of Independence, setting off a series of confrontations in which the colonists ousted the Brits from Boston. The Brits responded by capturing New York, and shortly thereafter, George Washington famously crossed the Delaware for major victories in Trenton and Princeton. A notable 1777 victory in Saratoga over the Brits was followed soon after by the King's capture of Philadelphia. It was then that Washington and his troops retreated for a harsh winter encamped in Valley Forge. Under intense conditions, the bedraggled army was overseen by a Prussian named General von Steuben, who used this time to transform the army into an organised unit capable of waging war on the British. Of major consequence, the French stepped in at this juncture, joining the Americans in their battle against the Brits. They hoped to prolong the conflict so as to weaken the sway of the British Empire, and soon signed both a commercial treaty and a treaty of alliance with the colonies. This was a major boon of resources and strategic support for the colonists, who faced the Brits on fronts from Louisiana to Quebec, fighting major American and French forces. His surrender marked the final stage in the war between the British Crown and the American colonies. So what was the lasting impact of the American Revolutionary War? Well, the war persisted between France and Britain for 2 more years. The Brits and Americans signed the Treaty of Paris in September 1783, which dictated that King George recognise American independence, evacuate British troops, surrender all territory east of the Mississippi River, and respect the seafaring and fishing rights of this new nation. The lasting impact was far-reaching, birthing not just a new nation in the United States, but setting forth a model for independence and constitutional self-governance that would alter the course of global history. This marked the beginning of a transition away from the age of colonization and toward the emergence of the constitutional republic. The model would take hold in struggles for independence throughout the world during the next 150 years and beyond. Moreover, this marked the founding of a future major world power, one whose influence would do nothing less than shape the world in the 20th century. More immediately, this marked a major blow to the sphere of power held by the British monarchy. Now we have the French Revolution. In the nearly 90 years between the start of the 1700s and the outbreak of revolution, France's population swelled from 18 to 26 million. However, it remained a highly feudalist state where the harshest taxes were imposed upon the poor, urban and rural populations. While King Louis was sympathetic to the plight of France's peasantry, he lacked the power and political will to stand up to a ruling elite class. As a result, crises of food shortage, rising prices and massive unemployment spiralled out of control. The French court drew much of the public's resentment, including infamous figures like the Austrian-born Queen Marie Antoinette, whom the public viewed as an outsider and a spy, whose lavish lifestyle was funded by taxation on the poor. This resentment collided with the philosophical period known as the Enlightenment. Works by thinkers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau had a profound impact on ideals about freedom, liberty and equality among intellectuals and an increasingly literate public. The result was a movement to oppose the monarch. This movement merged multiple French classes against the king. The kingdom was enveloped in violent protest. In response to this growing crisis, King Louis summoned the Estates General of 1789, a General Assembly composed of representatives from 3 distinct classes: the First Estate, or the clergy, the Second Estate, or the nobles, and the Third Estate, which was the commoners. Held in close proximity to the palace in Versailles, and reflecting a drastically unequal structure that largely prevented the Third Estate from exercising its position on any given dispute, the Assembly only exacerbated tensions. The commoners brought an end to the Assembly by forming the National Assembly and inviting their fellow estates to join in a fight against the Crown. 100 members of the First Estate joined. This event marked the initiation of the period known as the French Revolution. The National Assembly announced its intention to gather an act which Louis attempted to prevent by closing off the intended venue, Salle d'État. Their assembly instead gathered at a nearby tennis court and was joined by the entirety of the First Estate, as well as a significant portion of the Second Estate. They asserted that they would remain assembled until the monarchy accepted the creation of a new constitution. forced to accept these terms, but others in the royal family, Antoinette among them, pushed for a more forceful response. As rumours swirled that the Swiss Guard might soon be called in to quash the gathering, members of the general public flowed into the streets to support the new National Assembly. Not only did the elite Garde Française soldiers refuse to disperse the crowd, but many joined in storming the prison fortress called the Bastille. The Bastille's rapid destruction on July 14, 1789 would become a major symbolic flashpoint in the revolution. The newly empowered National Assembly abolished feudalism, removed the exemption to taxation previously enjoyed by the nobles, established equality before the law, opened public office to all citizens, and established religious freedom. With direct influence and support from Thomas Jefferson, recently victorious in his own American Revolution, the French produced the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. Many historians would argue that in its explicit abolishment of feudalism and other elitist privileges, this document went further to proliferate Enlightenment principles than did America's Declaration of Independence. In just 4 months, the existing structures of power in France had been dismantled by radical revolution. Soon after the first shockwaves of the revolution, France entered a period of relative calm. However, unrest and armed conflict continued throughout parts of the country where a new central authority had yet to establish itself. Moreover, the various dimensions of the National Assembly, which now included a reluctant Louis, splintered into suspicion, disagreement, and spin-off parliamentary assemblies. Even the military was divided in its loyalties, with most officers coming from nobility and most soldiers coming from common stock. As local peasantry rose up against the nobles who once held domain over them, many nobles fled to other parts of Europe, where they pleaded with other monarchies to join in the effort to defend the French crown. By 1792, the French revolutionary armies faced opposition from numerous European powers who feared the spread of monarchical revolutionary thinking. A confrontation in April between the French army and the allied forces of the Prussian and Austrian armies led to an eventual victory for the newly minted French forces. Empowered by their victory, the National Convention abolished the monarchy and initiated the trials that would soon lead to the execution by guillotine of both Louis and Marie Antoinette. Indeed, this would mark the initiation of the Reign of Terror, a period during which thousands, particularly of the noble and clergy classes, were publicly beheaded for perceived counter-revolutionary sentiments. This marked the establishment of the First Republic of France. Next on this list we have the Mexican-American War. So, this began in 1846. In 1836, though, a cross-section of colonists and Tejanos from Texas staged a rebellion against the Mexican government, which claimed authority over the territory. Rising tensions between the growing population of colonists from the United States and the increasingly centralist Mexican government of General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna led to Texas Revolution. This revolution was set a series of events in motion that would have significant long-term implications for the shared border between the neighbouring states. So central to the dispute was ongoing disagreement over the future of chattel slavery in the US. Mexico had abolished slavery in 1829, motivated largely by the designed to discourage the influx of Americans immigrating to the Texas territory. This, alongside a series of property taxes and increased tariffs on American goods, heightened tensions. In the midst of these tensions, Mexico closed the Texas border to further arrivals. Undeterred, Americans continued their illegal migration to the future state. In March of 1836, American settlers declared Texas an independent republic. This move was actually part of a larger series of Mexican Federalist wars in which various territories resisted Santa Anna's authority. The general entered the Texas territory and routed the Texian army in a series of battles, most famously the bloody Battle of Alamo, where a small and poorly armed contingent of Texian soldiers was besieged and massacred by Santa Anna's army. General Sam Houston of the Texian army reversed the course of conflict by drilling his soldiers into fighting form, confronting a complacent Mexican army, and ultimately capturing Santa Anna himself. The Texans traded his life in exchange for recognition of their independence. While Santa Anna was forced at the threat of death to sign this agreement, tension and conflict persisted between Texas and Mexico over the next decade. It came to a head with the election of US President James K. Polk, who entered office with the promise that he would expand America's territory into Texas and Oregon. In 1845, he made good on this promise by peacefully annexing the independent republic. This move instigated a conflict over America's proposed border, which placed the dividing line between the two nations at the Rio Grande. Mexico asserted that the border should instead be placed at the more northern Nueces River, or Nueces River. The result was a disputed territory resting between these two rivers. Polk sent US troops to the territory, ultimately instigating Mexican forces to initiate hostilities. Upon being attacked, the US declared war. US forces quickly obtained the upper hand in the conflict, occupying, in addition to Texas, the regional capital of Santa Fe in the future state of New Mexico, and the province known as Alta California, which included the Baja California Peninsula, as well as all of California, Nevada and Utah, as well as parts of Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico and Wyoming. However, when Mexico refused surrender, US troops expanded their occupation into Mexican territory, including the capital Mexico City. This strategy ultimately pressured Mexico to sit down at the negotiating table. Though domestic politics made this a very difficult and prolonged negotiation, a treaty was reached in 1848, in which Mexico ultimately recognized America's new borders, and in which America agreed to pay $15 million for reconstruction after the war. So, the Mexican-American War had several profound repercussions, not the least of which was the expansion of American borders on a massive scale. On the other side of the newly established demarcation at the Rio Grande, Mexico emerged with crippling financial woes and political disarray. The US would face down its own crisis in the aftermath of the war, however. The slavery dispute arose in earnest for the new state of Texas, and highlighted the philosophical divide on this issue between America's North and South. The former held that there was to be no further expansion of the practice of chattel slavery, whereas the latter, with considerable support from many inhabitants of Texas itself, believed it was destined to become a slave state. Ongoing disagreement on this subject would help set the stage for the American Civil War, is noteworthy that a great many soldiers who helped achieve victory in the conflict against Mexico would be squaring off against one another just 15 years later. The penultimate war in this video is the Taiping Rebellion, which started in 1850. So, rather than seeking to supplant the existing dynasty, the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom wished to establish a new dominion and began by carving out an enormous sphere of influence in southern China. I should have mentioned this is between the Manchu Qing dynasty and the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom. So, from within this sphere, both sides engaged in a decade of minor skirmishes along the Yangtze Valley. By 1850, these various skirmishes had coalesced into all-out war. The conflict that followed ranks among the most horrific in human history. It was the most significant conflict in China since the Mongol Conquest of 1644. And as with the previous battle for authority over China, this one covered a vast expanse of regions. The Hakka were notoriously intolerant of their enemies and celebrated occupation of new territories with massacres and strict religious edicts. These tactics helped to make this the single bloodiest conflict of the 19th century and the deadliest civil war in human history. Historians place the number of casualties between 30 and 50 million, with another 30 million displaced by the fighting. The decentralized nature of the conflict meant the Hakka forces faced not just the armies of the Qing dynasty, but also an array of unaffiliated troops determined to defend their regions. It was in conflict with one such force, the Xiang army in Nanjing, where Hong Xihuan was killed. 1 month later the city fell, and the rebellion was over. So the lasting impact of the Taiping Rebellion, though the Qing dynasty was able to preserve its seat of authority for the time being, the toll of the war was absolutely enormous. The cost in terms of money, destruction and human life was so extreme and damaging that it may be argued that the Qing dynasty never recovered. After nearly 200 years of uncontested rule, the Qing was now only 50 years away from collapse. The next several decades saw a fracturing of its authority and a rise in regionalism across the expansive state. This splintering was hastened by tension between various Chinese ethnic and religious groups. These forces had the impact of significantly weakening imperial power, ultimately setting the stage for an early 20th century rebellion and, by 1911, a total revolutionary overthrow of imperial China. Emerging from the smoke of conflict would be the newly established Communist Republic of China. And our final conflict of this video is the American Civil War, which is, a biggie. This began in 1861. So, between 1774 and 1804, every northern state abolished slavery, though it's worth noting that the practice was never particularly widespread in the northeast or New England regions. While there was always a fair share of opportunists and businessmen in the north who participated in the slave trade, the practice of African slavery was largely a southern phenomenon. In fact, the first half of the century saw most of the world's major powers in Europe and the United Kingdom criminalise the slave trade and abolish slavery. The highly agrarian economy of the southern United States, by contrast, depended wholly on the source of labour provided by the African slave trade. This, combined with a permeating belief in white supremacy, inclined the South to rally around what was otherwise a dying institution. The threat against the practice practice of slavery was to many Southerners a threat to their very way of life. While the northern states influenced the passage of various laws criminalizing the international slave trade and restricting the expansion of slavery into new territories, the South dug its heels in and resolved to defend its right to slavery. The Republican Party was, during this period in time, an explicitly anti-slavery party, whereas the Southern Democrats, who took their cue from the presidency of Andrew Jackson, argued for continued Western expansion not just of the United States, but of slavery as well. When the conclusion of the Mexican-American War dramatically expanded America's territorial holdings, it also ignited a decade of tension over how slavery would be addressed in said new territories. These tensions came to a boiling point during the 1860 presidential election, when the Republicans nominated the vocally anti-slavery candidate, Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln vowed that, if elected president, he would stand in the way of any efforts to expand the practice of slavery. In return, the Southern states promised that a victory for Lincoln would be the end of the Union. Upon Lincoln's election, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, and Texas seceded from the United States and declared themselves the Confederate States of America, the CSA. Arkansas, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Virginia followed soon after. Two territories that had not yet been granted statehood, Kentucky and Missouri, also joined the Confederacy. Though an array of economic, cultural, and political issues were implicated in the long and bloody war which followed, slavery was truly at the heart of the conflict. Of the 32 million people living in the United States at the time, some 4 million were African slaves. For the Confederacy, this followed a centrally held belief, expressed in a prominent speech by Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. The war itself began on April 12th of 1861, when Fort Sumter in Charleston was besieged by the South Carolina militia. Though the United States Army returned fire, the fort was ultimately captured by the militia, bringing about the start of hostilities that would persist for 4 years. Though the emergent Confederate Army succeeded in carving out an expansive sphere of territory at the outset of the war, Union troops quickly stifled the Confederacy in the West, crushing their river navy and dismantling their western armies entirely by 1862. That same year, Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, making the practice of slavery entirely unlawful in the United States. Soon thereafter, the North captured New Orleans, split the Confederate Army in half at the Mississippi with its victory in Vicksburg, and by 1863 had stifled Confederate General Robert E. Lee's forces at Gettysburg, ending any attempts at capturing Northern Territory. With this success overseeing the Army's Western campaign, Ulysses S. Grant became the General of all Union armies in 1864, and used the authority to bombard the Confederacy from all angles, blockading all southern ports with superior naval power, capturing the city of Atlanta and leaving it in smouldering ruins, as General William Tecumseh Sherman led his troops on their famous march to the sea. Heavy losses were experienced on both sides, an estimated 600 to 750,000 fallen soldiers and an untold number of civilians. But the greater destruction was visited upon the South. The war effectively ended in April of 1865 when General Lee signed his surrender to General Grant at the Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. The Confederacy was abandoned, and efforts began to both return the southern states to the Union and to navigate the practical abolition of slavery in the South. So, lasting impact of the American Civil War. The most obvious, important and immediate impact would be the abolition of slavery. With their return to the Union, the southern states that had long relied on African slavery to fuel their plantation system and agrarian economy were now forced to transform their society and economy. Millions of freed slaves departed for opportunities in America's northern cities, a pattern that would alter the racial makeup of the US in perpetuity. Those that remained behind faced a southern racial hierarchy that was not only unchanged by the war, but was in some ways only magnified by the bitterness and resentment of the defeated South. The period immediately after the war is known as the era of Reconstruction, in which national resources and Union troops were dispersed in the South to help rebuild its decimated infrastructure and integrate the population of freed slaves. However, tensions and political change, particularly with the 1876 presidential election of Rutherford B. Hayes, brought an end to Reconstruction. As Union troops filtered out of the southern states, a new form of racial hierarchy known as Jim Crow took hold. For the next century, the South maintained a system of racial segregation that continues to have a defining impact on America's cultural, racial and political outlook to date. And that, my friends, is going to conclude it for this nice and long history video. I can see that the next one on the list is World War I, which we've done a dedicated video on, but you know, it's always an interesting topic. So, and after that is Russian Revolution, which I've already got planned to do a full video on because I studied Russian history at A level and it's super interesting. But yes, that is going to do it for tonight's video. Remember, 300 likes